Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of various elements of Japanese culture and music and such. I'm not going to say baby metal here, though I just did, because this is obviously not going to be about that. A couple of times, people somewhat rashly in comments have said, "Oh, I could listen to you talk about anything." Okay, well, I guess we're going to find out. At the moment, I'm almost done with the baby metal stuff. There are other Japanese bands that I want to keep talking about. Now I'll do some more videos on those. But I also wanted to just do something a little different. And this is the first time I've done a review of a TV show. And I'm a big TV fan. I have some stuff in development for TV myself at the moment, and I've always loved good television. And movies as well, but good TV really appeals to me, and so I want to maybe do. We'll see. Maybe we'll see how this goes. But I'm quite interested in talking more about TV, making sort of impromptu videos and discussing it, and whether people will watch them or not, we'll see. As I said before. This channel is not monetized. I don't make any money off it. So, if you want to help out, if you want to help me sort of find the will to keep making videos, a couple of ways you can help me. One way is by buying a book. And I'm easy to find, AJ Hartley or Andrew Hart. I write under both names. And you'll find those on Amazon anywhere. Or I'm also in the process of, hopefully by the time this video goes up, I'll have done it, and I'll put the link in the description below. I'm setting up a Patreon account, and some of you may know what that is, and some of you may not. A Patreon account allows people to give a little money periodically to support the creation of something that they value. And for that, and you get stuff back. So you can do it just by giving a few bucks once a month, and to support somebody who you think is making art which you value and they're not getting anything from it, or not much, or to help them in the process of producing that art. And then there are tiers above that where the more you commit, the more you get. Maybe you get a sneak peek at something, or you get your name mentioned in a book or whatever. And so, I'll put the link in the description below, and you can take a look. So, all right, let's get on with this review. So, in 2018, an adaptation, a version of Sherlock Holmes was made by HBO Asia called Miss Sherlock.
ダメだって勝手に入っちゃう。性交渉は週に何回？素手で触るなよ。なんで警部が
警察官だからって無神経にも程があるんじゃないですか。
警察官じゃないけど。は？
また遺体が出た。誰か来てください。シャーロック。
シャーロック。イギリスのことわざに好奇心は猫をも殺すってあるんだ。シャーロック。
How great is that looking? Now, and I'll just come right out now and say the show's great. It's really, really good. Before I get to it, I want to sort of contextualize my own interest in Sherlock Holmes and in the previous TV and film adaptations which have come before this particular version, and then I'll talk about this particular version. If you want to skip over the next section, you can, but some of the way that I'm assessing this new Japanese language adaptation of Sherlock Holmes is specifically in terms of some of the previous versions, and particularly in terms of the BBC version with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. I should say that, my own interest in Sherlock Holmes is also because I'm a writer. I will talk about where my own interest in Sherlock Holmes came from. But I've written books that were inspired by Sherlock Holmes. The Steeplejack series, for instance, specifically has that sort of Victorian gas lamp kind of feel to it, even though it's set in another world entirely. So, yes, let's get to the prehistory, as it were, and then I'll talk specifically about this particular version. So I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan. I started reading those stories, particularly the short stories, when I was about 15 or 16. I remember staying in the school library to work on The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Returned Casebook and all that stuff. And they captivated me then as, study in one of the sort of quintessential examples of the detective story, but also because the stories themselves have a sensational component. They're often strange. They're not just mysteries. There's often an element of the grotesque or the bizarre to them. And of course, they center on the character of Holmes, whose logical, deductive reasoning and his observational skills are the sort of bedrock of those stories. And, I think one of the reasons they appealed to me then, as they still appeal to me now, is that they are the sort of triumph of bookish intellectual people, rather than, and not to say that I don't like other kinds of detective stories, hard-boiled PI detective stories and things like that, but there is something about this sort of very cerebral solution, the guy whose work, yes, he's observing, and yes, sometimes what he's doing gets physical, but most of what he does is he's in his head, and he'll have like the 3-pipe problem or something, where he sort of sits there and smokes and smokes and smokes and just does nothing. And there's something I think very relatable for writers, and it's not an accident that he becomes a figure that writers themselves like to sort of refer back to. And and certainly until Agatha Christie's Poirot and Miss Marple, he is the sort of the ultimate example of the consulting detective, the person whose stories aren't shackled by police procedure, and by the sort of the internal workings of how crime detection actually works. So there's something freeing about that. So I loved these stories, and I've read them all many times. I'm currently listening to the Stephen Fry reading of all of them. I've already listened to them once, and it's like 70 hours. It's the books and the short stories. And I'm nearly done the second time through. Partly because also Fry has some really interesting little observations in his own little forewords, in his own personal experience, which in many ways is like mine. As a child discovering these books and falling in love with them and wanting to somehow embody them, So, not only have I was very invested in them as an adolescent, I then started seeking out the various adaptations in film and TV in which Holmes was presented. And of course, they go back pretty much to Conan Doyle's own day, right? Those stage productions in his own day of Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes has been a staple throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. And there are old sort of silent film versions, some of them serious, some of them tongue-in-cheek, and then of course monumental, famous actors playing the role, like people like Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, famously, of course, working as Holmes and Watson. I always found Rathbone's Holmes a little cold and patrician for my tastes, but and Nigel Bruce is maybe a little much of a buffoon for Watson, but still great stuff, you know. And then, you know, other sort of off the beaten track kind of incarnations like The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes with Robert Stevens in the 70s, which was fantastic. 70s or early 80s, I forget, but really good. And of course, the sort of quintessential production for me growing up was the Granada TV versions, which began screening in 84 and ran all the way to 94 with Jeremy Brett, who to me is in some ways the definitive TV version of Holmes as he was written by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I'll come back to this in a second, but let me first say an obvious proviso here. When we're talking about the transmission of something that existed as a book or serialized in magazines, things like that, as the Sherlock Holmes stories did, and we're seeing them that transformed into either a stage play or a TV show or a movie, the process is by definition a process of adaptation. There's no such thing as a straight, correct incarnation of these books and stories on film or TV. Can't be done, right? This is both theoretically and practically, it's not possible. Because, I mean, you know, this is a familiar idea perhaps, but any process by which the means of signification go from letters on a page to bodies in space means that the mode of communication, the mode of signification, the communication of meaning is totally different. And there is no way to simply broadcast the book. It cannot be done, all right? Even a reading means that you're using the voice of an actor who has various associations and dialects and issues and choices that actor is making as they read, even though they're reading just the words on the page. It's a different experience from simply reading the book by yourself. When you read the book by yourself, you're creating the images, right? The author is pushing you in certain directions, but a lot of the specifics, a lot of the way that you imagine characters or places or whatever is coming from your own head. So the moment you cast an actor, you know, that changes. So that's my sort of little proviso that goes with everything that I'm about to say. All performance is adaptation. Okay? So it's then a question to a certain extent of how, you know, it's not a binary. It's not either true to the original or not true to the original. It's a continuum. We're going to sort of, some things are going to be closer to the original and some things are going to be more radically adaptive and further away from it. You know, I mean, in terms of modern versions of Sherlock Holmes, you think of something like Elementary, which has a female Watson and a completely different set of stories in a contemporary setting. But to push the adaptive thing a little bit further, what about something like House, right? In which the Holmes character is now a doctor. He still has his Watson, who's now a Wilson. He's still a misanthrope, a curmudgeon. He's still a royal pain in the ass a lot of the time. He's still a kind of diagnostic genius, but it's a different thing. But he still lives at 221B, right? So, you know, the show is conscious of its connections between Holmes and House. And you push it even further. You say a man's home or homes is his castle. Another consulting detective, another writer in this case, right? That's, you know, as close as the stories kind of get to maintaining that. But there are, though Castle will occasionally quote from Sherlock Holmes, but it's a much more tongue-in-cheek, much more playful, much looser. It's not an adaptation recognizably of Sherlock Holmes. It's merely one of the many, many outgrowths getting further and further away from the original, but preserving something of the spirit of that original. As far as adaptations, as I say, my favorite as a representation at this end of the spectrum, closer to Arthur Conan Doyle's original, Jeremy Brett is a master. And it was the first time we'd seen a real attempt, I think, on TV at least, to recreate a very Victorian sense of what London was like, and then to inhabit it with these characters. And there's a meticulous sense of detail, not just in the set dressing and costuming and stuff, but also in the presentation of the Holmes character. Sometimes with those early performances, the Basil Rathbone and stuff, it gets a bit one note. It gets a bit, we're playing an idea of Sherlock Holmes rather than the character. We're saying the guy with the deerstalker and the ridiculous huge pipe, which I don't think is ever referred to. He has a traveling hat with flaps, I think. So I guess that's the deerstalker. I'm talking about in the books, in the stories. I'm trying to think if there's ever a reference to the huge pipe, which you sometimes see as a Sherlock Holmes trapping. I can't think of one, actually. It may be in some of the original illustrations that go with them, but I can't think of that pipe ever being part of the actual story. Doesn't matter. But I do think that sometimes with Sherlock Holmes, there's a tendency to play a sort of generalized idea, a received idea of what Holmes is. He's so familiar to modern audiences that he's one of those sort of iconic figures. You see the deerstalker in the pipe and you know exactly who it is, right? Jeremy Brett doesn't do that. Jeremy Brett plays Holmes as a person, and as a person who's profoundly, as an actor, he's profoundly informed by the books and incredible attention to detail. And I think you'll notice that, one of the things that people talk a lot about in terms of an influence on a show like Miss Sherlock is they talk a lot about the BBC version. And there's an assumption that a lot of the mannerisms and the physicality and stuff come specifically from Cumberbatch. And that's not true. There are elements that Cumberbatch brings to the role, but a lot of that stuff had been done before. And Brett is perhaps the supreme example of that. Brett is also a manic depressive. And so I think he brings a lot of that side of the character and the things that make him difficult, but also make him oddly vulnerable in ways that the BBC Sherlock, for example, is not. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, if you haven't seen the Granada TV versions, go back and check them out. I have them all on DVD. I used to watch them when they first came out, but late 80s, I was in Japan, so I didn't see them. So I had to sort of catch up after the fact. But I still love them. I still love him. I think he's a genius. And I did really like the BBC Sherlock. I loved the first season, and there were things about the second season that I really liked. It lost me somewhat in season 3, and I don't want to supply too many spoilers, but in case you haven't seen it, this is a Stephen Moffat show. Stephen Moffat, of course, wrote some really brilliant standalone Doctor Who episodes and then became the showrunner for Doctor Who. And I think we've seen some of the things that Moffat likes, both in the Doctor Who series that he was showrunner for, and in things like Sherlock. And sometimes they are things that I don't particularly like. He's fond of the twist solution, where everything seems impossible, and then suddenly there's a kind of magical escape, which is never fully explained. And I find that, as a writer particularly, I find that lazy. And tiresome, and ultimately it starts to lower the stakes for the show, because when things start to look really bleak, but then you constantly, week after week, see the character magically solve the problem, magically escape from danger, and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't really make sense. But it also then lowers your sense of investment, because when things start to look really dark next week, you're immediately a little distanced from it because you know he's going to get out of it because he always does, right? So, and that's a Moffat thing. And I think it reflects a different attitude to the Holmes character, either from the Jeremy Brett version and certainly from the Miss Sherlock version. So let me say, one of the reasons I got increasingly frustrated with the BBC version, well, a couple of things. They're all related though. There's an odd masculine ethos to a lot of Moffat's writing, a version of manhood that he particularly seems to idolize, whether that's because that's who he is or it's because of who he wants to be and isn't. I don't know. I don't know enough about him, but he really loves these remote, clever, showy men who everybody falls in love with, despite the fact that they show no feelings for any of those people most of the time. And so I think, and you see it in Doctor Who, and you see it in Cumberbatch's Sherlock Holmes, a sense that this is a character who everybody is immediately dazzled by, despite the fact that he is, it seems, a kind of high-functioning sociopath, incapable of the most basic human emotion. And one of the things that I found particularly trying is the emotional side of the story resides entirely on Watson, Martin Freeman, who's, I think, brilliant throughout. But even Watson gets treated this way a little bit, you know, and I don't think it's any great spoiler to say, you know, that there's a point at which Holmes dies, right? The Reichenbach Falls episode. And Watson is absolutely wrecked by it. And while a part of me completely gets that, there's another part of me that's sort of baffled by it. So yeah, but why exactly? Why did you like him? I understand why you admired him. I don't really understand why you like him, because most of the time he's just an ass, you know? And that whole Reichenbach Falls thing never made any sense to me. It frequently doesn't in adaptation. He seems to die, and then somehow he didn't. But the show, the BBC version, constantly dodges the real explanation as to how exactly what seemed to happen didn't happen. So that's one of those things that I find frustrating. But the deeper problem, I think, is the emotional one. And as I say, it affects Watson too. You know, cleverly, the BBC version makes Watson. He's recently come back from Afghanistan as Conan Doyle's Watson has come back from Afghanistan 100 years earlier, which tells you something about how our international foreign policy has been working for the last century. When Martin Freeman's Watson comes back from Afghanistan, he has a cane, and he has a gun in his room, and there's a sense of trauma, and there's a sense of being sort of cut off from the world around him by virtue of his experience as a soldier, as an army doctor. Except that it turns out that the limp and the cane are not real, you know? I mean, and one of the things that the Holmes character diagnoses of him is that this is not a physical injury, it's psychosomatic. And when Holmes, or rather when Moffat, through Holmes, uses a word like psychosomatic, what they mean is not real. And in one of their first sort of chase encounters, he forgets the cane and he runs and everything's fine. And the cane is basically then gone. And as is any sense of trauma of Watson's wartime experience, right? That we float it as a character note, but what Watson really wants is to be back in adventure and danger. And the moment he gets that, then the sense of any kind of trauma from the war is gone, right? which to me plays into the whole ambience of the BBC version of this sort of boys' own adventure fantasy, in which there's not a lot of reality, and particularly not a lot of practical life and emotional reality for any of the characters involved. They are, and I think that's one of the reasons that the women in the show get treated so poorly, Mrs. Hudson notwithstanding. The episode with the pseudo Chinese plot, where it's like a series of stereotypes and conventions that could have been written 100 years ago, about the circus mysterious and it's like, are any of these people supposed to be real people? And this happens when you're dealing with Asian cultures. There is a castle episode late in the show when things are getting a little, I forget which season it is, 6 or 7. I'm not sure. There's a ninja episode, which is deeply stupid. I love that show. I think there's a lot of great things in it. I could quite happily do videos on all of my favorite detective shows, and maybe I will, since I'm running out of baby metal to talk about. But there is a sort of a sense that none of the characters in the BBC Sherlock are real people. That they're cartoon characters that look like they've emerged from the kind of action adventure stories that were the inspiration for things like Indiana Jones, right? So anyway, so a lot of the characters don't really feel like real people, which means that we get a lot of dazzle and a lot of glitz, but there's not as much humanity as I would like, personally. And I think, this is one of the reasons that by season 3, the show has become something quite different. It's no longer a consulting detective thing. It's now become something like a James Bond movie or something, which is bizarre, and it's all sort of government conspiracies and high-tech stuff. And it's strayed much, much further away on that sort of adaptive strand, right? It's moved much further away from the original impulse behind the stories, and becomes less and less plausible as it resolves more and more on those kind of magical escape solutions, which I've mentioned before. The James Bond thing is actually not a bad comparison, because I think Moffat still loves the Sean Connery incarnation of James Bond. And I did, growing up. I did as an adolescent, because I was a teenager. And Bond was, everything I wasn't, everything most adolescent boys aren't and want to be. He's sexy, and he gets the girl, and he, beats the bad guy, and he's the hero, and he's decisive, and he's action driven, and all the rest of it. None of which I was. And it's part of the appeal. But what bothers me about it is that, he gets the girl, but he also doesn't want the girl particularly. He'll use the girl and then he'll move on. And he'll frequently sacrifice the girl. In these early Bond films, this happens a lot, right? Very, very different from everything from, like, Timothy Dalton onwards. Actually, even in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, right? But certainly from Timothy Dalton onwards, and particularly with Daniel Craig, a very different notion of who Bond is, particularly in his relationship with women. And as I say, I think that Moffat still loves this idea of the remote hero who doesn't finally care about anybody. And that's the Connery Bond. And that is Sherlock, right on cue. Thank you, Sherlock, for protecting me from the mailman. So the BBC Sherlock was, of course, wildly successful. It, in many ways, relaunched the popularity of the character and the stories, and it was very clever in the way that it approached a lot of those elements of the original stories and gave them a radical new shift. So that for fans of the books, they could see points of connection to the original story without knowing where this version of the story was actually going to go. And of course, it embraced the contemporary world and the contemporary technology, so the stories felt, new and exciting and interesting, whatever their other issues. And also, I should mention Mark Gatiss, who plays Mycroft, who's also a writer and a terrific actor for that particular role. He also shows up in Doctor Who. So the BBC version is seen by many people as having a direct causal link to Miss Sherlock. And that's part of why I wanted to spend some time talking about it. And this is and is not true. If you look at some people's sort of popular videos responding to Miss Sherlock, you'll see a lot of this with a sense of people saying, well, they took the BBC version and then put it in Japan. And that's really not what happened at all. I mean, looking at it. And I think sometimes people who say this partly are not familiar with Japanese culture, so they're missing a lot of the nuance of the way the characters function, the way they think, and the world that is created. So partly I wanted to offer a little corrective to that. There are some interesting notes of comparison between the two shows. You'll hear some of it. For example, there are elements within the music where they both use combination of strings and a kind of plinky-plonky street organ kind of vaguely Victorian sort of sound, which is somehow sort of ironized or put in inverted commas by the very sort of contemporary settings of both. Another thing that the two shows have in common is that they both sometimes use the overlaying of digital data onto the screen to simulate the workings of Holmes's mind, something that's also used in the Robert Downey Jr. films. There are comparisons, I think, in some of the larger arc of the season. The placement of the sort of Moriarty kind of character, which is a feature of both shows in ways that, in the books, Moriarty's a minor figure. He appears in like one story, maybe two, I forget. I didn't need to look. But I mean, the Reichenbach Falls episode, I'm trying to think if that's the first time Moriarty's actually mentioned in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It might be. And it's weird because it's common in adaptations where Moriarty becomes this figure who's seeded throughout and becomes the sort of arch nemesis. But for the stories, it really doesn't work like that at all. He's retroactively created as an arch nemesis, but he's only there for one thing, and then he's gone. So there are points of connection and comparison between Miss Sherlock and the BBC version, but they're so tonally different. Somewhat remarkably, it is, I think, the only certainly mainstream version of these stories featuring both a female Holmes and a female Watson, as well as a Mrs. Hudson character and a number of other key figures. And I think it's kind of brilliant. It's a wonderful, adaptive approach to these stories where the Japaneseness of the context makes perfect sense and inflects both the stories and the relationships in really, really interesting and productive ways, as does the femininity of the character and the people around her. That some of what makes her strange and difficult is clearly also connected to the fact that she's a woman, you know, in a particular masculine world. The police, you know, when you see the rooms of police officers, and it's all middle-aged men, you know, and there's something very real about that, you know, that however much things have changed in Japan, a lot of elements, a lot of aspects of the culture are still very patriarchal, you know, and there are boxes in which women sometimes have to be able to fit themselves, you know. There are wonderful moments where the Watson character is working in a sort of traditional, I guess it's a restaurant, or it feels almost like the breakfast room of a hotel or something, you know. And she's wearing a full kimono, and her body language is completely different from the way that we normally see her. You know, there's a moment as she's walking into a room where she's sort of sad, she's depressed, you know, and frustrated and melancholy, and she sort of puts on the smile before going into the room because that's what's expected of her. That's her job, you know. Wato-san is played by Kenjiya Shihori. And she is, as is often the case in adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, the heart of the show and its everyman anchor. But she's also much more than that. She has her own issues here, her own struggles to fit in with the world around her because of what she's been through, which is, as I said, much more extended as an idea than it is in the BBC version. And her own needs to connect with other people. Martin Freeman doesn't get to do that very much because Martin Freeman doesn't get to do that very much because Stephen Moffat doesn't think he should need anyone but Sherlock. Whereas Wato-san does need people. She needs connection because most of us do. And being impressed by Sherlock doesn't take that away. And she becomes, in some ways, the focus of the show, not merely a bystander designed to show off Sherlock's cleverness, because she helps to shape the show's range of strong and complex female characters, all of whom are, in some ways, trying to carve out a place for themselves in a male-dominated culture. All of whom are trying to carve out a place for themselves in a male-dominated culture, somehow. In that sense, rather than being merely a foil to Sherlock, the ordinary person designed to show off how his genius, or her genius in this case, she actually shares something profound with Sherlock, a sense of being slightly out of step with the familiar world that she's grown up in. As such, she's the element most clearly anchoring the production's Japaneseness, its grace, its beauty, its sense of the way people are connected, but also its lingering rigidity over what constitutes normal behavior, especially for women. You know, Sherlock is rude, you know. The way she talks, the way that her voice comes down is unfeminine in certain respects. The way she answers the phone, she doesn't say mushy mushy or any of the various sort of polite ways of answering the phone in Japan. She says, "Nani? What? Yes?" You know, there's an abrupt quality. She pushes past people. And the sense of single-mindedness and the irrelevance of all this sort of social niceties and stuff, I think, come across really well, but particularly because there's something very Japanese about this particular version of them, you know? But that her brand of individualism is also something that separates her from other people in ways that is sort of problematic for her as well as for other people, you know? And I think that it's not heavy-handed. it's not. It doesn't sermonize. It doesn't stand up and make speeches about social, political, cultural issues. It doesn't do that. But you can glimpse it. You just have to be receptive to it. You have to watch it in the spirit in which it's given to you, rather than sitting there, as I think some critics have, seeing it as a kind of weird Japanese knockoff of a show from somewhere else. It's not that. It's better than that. I would go so far as to say I certainly like it better than the BBC Sherlock. I wish there was more of it. The Mycroft figure, whose name is Kento Futaba, in this version is played by Ozawa Yukiyoshi. Oh, there's a wonderful kind of double act by the lead inspector, is played by Takito Kenichi, and his assistant, who finishes up doing most of the work and who's particularly irritated by Sherlock, whereas the inspector is mostly amused by her. And the show doesn't go out of its way to simply make people look stupid in comparison to Sherlock, which is another familiar trope of the Sherlock Holmes stories, where the Sherlock is the only clever person and everyone around him are morons, and the show takes a certain delight in pointing out their stupidity. This doesn't do that. The show is dotted with quotes from the original stories. One of the ones that comes up a couple of times is that familiar Sherlock Holmes remark about, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Some form of that frequently shows up in Sherlock Holmes adaptations, and this one is no exception. And it's like a series of little Easter eggs that the show gives you. If you know the Sherlock Holmes well, you're going to find occasional references that don't get explored and don't get clarified, little name references to other things that you might have come across in the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Devil's Foot, the Sussex Vampire, a number of things that are there present, where the show shows its recognition and homage to the original stories, which I think is cool. You can watch it if you don't have HBO, you watch it on Amazon Prime. You may have to pay for it, but it's not very expensive, and it's absolutely worth it. She also lives, of course, at 221B. The house that she lives in is sort of an interesting mix of the Japanese and the Western, and it's a Western which looks in many ways quite Victorian. It's a version of an old European version of architecture and furniture and so on, which is quite unusual. And it's and people comment on the strangeness of it. And it's like the show is deliberately referencing the idea that what we're dealing with here as a character is this sort of hybrid, sort of cross-pollination of a Japanese environment and a European, specifically European story tradition, and character. And that these things are sort of informing each other in productive and interesting ways. Takeuchi Yuko's Sherlock, man, she's so good. She's so good in this, and she's quirky and unconventional, but there's a playfulness to her, an impatience with other people's stupidity, and an impatience with specifically Japanese social convention, with the sort of generalized politeness that you get, and the Watson character, who is brilliantly, whose name is actually Watto, so it's Watto-san. Can't beat that, And she, also female, and she's constantly apologizing for Sherlock's behavior, and you see it the moment that. Yes, in all Sherlock Holmes performances, there's a sort of eccentricity to the physicality of the character, the way they sit, the fingertips together, which comes directly from the books. They're sort of hunched up on chairs, huddled up, or sprawling, a sort of an unusual physical self-presentation that you see. But it's particularly striking in Miss Sherlock because Japanese physicality tends to be more restrained and more in line with a set of sort of conventional assumptions. It's not just about bowing, it's about a physical restraint, you know. And when you see Sherlock in this, and the way she dresses, it's quite masculine a lot of the time. The way she carries herself, she takes these long strides. The physical confidence of her is very unfeminine within a Japanese context, and it is clearly sort of quite almost alarming to the other characters that they just don't know what to do with her, you know, which I think is a brilliant way to reimagine Holmes's separateness, right? And what I really want to emphasize is that for all her sort of eccentricity and quirkiness and impatience and frustration, she's not a sociopath. It's not that she feels nothing, you know. One of her phrases that she keeps using all the way through, whenever somebody references Watson as her friend, and she says, "Tomodachi janai," we're not friends. She's not my friend, and this becomes a repeated phrase, "Tomodachi janai." I won't tell you where that goes, but it goes somewhere, right? But every time she says it, there's a sense of it not really being true, you know? That there's something more complicated at work. And she's not cold. She's not unfeeling. She's fascinated by all kinds of things. They're just not the same things that other people are fascinated by. And there are even moments where you sense, very rare, it's very subtly, delicately handled. There are these moments where she seems conscious of her own separateness from ordinary people, from family and relationships, in ways that make her, for want of a better word, sad. And this sadness is momentary. You glimpse it, you know. But it feels like we're glimpsing something which is, to my mind, richer and deeper than we see in, say, the BBC version. And I think, it shapes my sense of the show because of the nature of the story about the actress herself, which I'll come to in a little while. Takeuchi isn't playing someone else's Holmes. She owns the role and makes it hers. Like the whole show, her performance manages to be both familiar and entirely fresh and unique. It's also a genuine engagement with the Japanese culture in which it's set. But this is not a Holmes who's emotionally stunted, nor set up to be admired by an audience who mistake emotional detachment for strength. She keeps her emotions in check, not because they are worthless or she doesn't feel them, but because they are distracting from her intellectual processes. Not because they're unimportant, but because, as a woman, she'll be judged for having them. And not because they're weak, but because when they land, they are extraordinarily powerful. We don't see this until late in the season, but when you do see it, it's really quite extraordinary. Her emotions are like the cello, which replaces the traditional Holmesian violin. It's a big, full-voiced instrument requiring real muscular effort to make it speak, but capable of tremendous range and deep, resonant soulfulness. I love this show. I've watched it a couple of times. And again, that again, in terms of taking people seriously as people, the Watson character has also recently come back from a war zone, in this case Syria, where she was working as a volunteer. I guess she's not a fully trained doctor, but she's working as some sort of medical assistant. And she also, like the Martin Freeman character, has a kind of PTSD, though it's not immediately apparent. Um, but when it starts to surface, it's taken much more seriously, and it affects the character throughout the season. And that sense of trauma and her emotional responses to the things that they experience really anchors the show, and makes it more than just a series of puzzles and gags and adventures. That there's more sort of human connectivity there. And I think it reinforces the sense that this is what this Sherlock needs. With the BBC version, much as I love Martin Freeman's character, I don't know why Sherlock needs him exactly. But with Miss Sherlock, there's an unspoken bond between them that gets generated. And as I said, still adversarial. They're still at each other's throats, in some cases literally, and it gets quite dark at times. But there's a sense of a sort of wrestling with a kind of essential human connectivity that I think is really important. It's a compassionate show, I think, in ways that the BBC Sherlock isn't. It's much more understanding of its people, and when it shows you trauma, it also shows you the roots of that trauma in its various sort of cases, along the way, in ways that I think is quite unusual, right? That frequently with adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, we're so fixated on the cleverness of the deduction that everybody else becomes wallpaper. And I don't think that's the case here, even though Miss Sherlock herself stands out. She's this absolutely sort of magnetic presence on camera, just beautiful and elegant and sophisticated and eccentric and fascinating to watch. Just remarkable. If the show has a weakness, it's that there's not enough of it. And I mean that in two ways. I mean, the episodes are a little short. Most of them are about 50 minutes. There's only 8 episodes in the first season, the only season. So that's the other side of it being too short. There's only one season, and there's not going to be a second, which is really too bad in lots of ways, which I'll get to. As far as the episodes themselves being a little on the short, I mean, they're like half the length of the BBC Sherlock ones, and that means that they can't get as much done. And there are certainly moments where I find myself thinking, I could have used another few minutes to unpack that particular leap within the plot, right? In terms of figuring out how we get from point C to point D. Sometimes it's going by a little fast, and that's not because I'm struggling with the subtitles or the language. It's because it's just not there, right? I think for the most part the subtitles are really good. They are somewhat selective. It's interesting when you can understand some of the Japanese or all of the Japanese, that it's interesting to see how certain things get translated, and what bits of information are left out as being, slowing your eye down too much. These are done really well, sparing, so you're following the dialogue, you're following the gist of what we need to without having to be reading all the time, and then you miss the visuals. But I do think it's well done. And it's also a great way, incidentally, if you're interested in Japanese language and culture, I think, shows like this are a great way to hear real Japanese spoken, not anime Japanese, because anime Japanese is a different thing, it's a heightened, mythic kind of thing, in which people use certain kinds of phrases all the time, which you don't actually hear spoken by ordinary Japanese people. This is closer, Now, it is still a little heightened, both in terms of the acting style and and the way people present themselves. And I think if you're not used to Japanese culture, people are sometimes a bit baffled by the sort of expressions of surprise, for example, that you see, the physical expressions of surprise, and you think, wait, people really do that? And the answer is yes, they do. Yes, yes, they do. It's one of the paradoxes of Japanese people that while there's a tremendous amount that traditionally is not being constantly articulated, a lot of sort of private thoughts and things that are held in check, there's also a lot of range for physical and facial expression, which by Western standards seems almost cartoonishly outsized, overscale, large, you know? When I was talking to Jaime about living in Japan and saying, you know, those expressions of people seeing me, the doors would open on the elevator and people would literally sort of freak out. Oh my God, it's a foreigner, you know? And this was in the 80s, and people are now used to foreigners in different ways. But the sort of excessive physical surprise was something I had never seen before, especially as a sort of a Lancashire lad where, you know, that kind of very demonstrative behavior is not considered cool, you know. So it was strange to see people being so excessively emotional in certain respects. And I think that's an idea that a lot of Westerners don't completely grasp. So they're looking at, and they think some of the acting is somehow less realist. And the other thing to say, of course, is that this is and is not a realist show, which is conscious of that in the same way that all adaptations of Sherlock Holmes are simultaneously real and not real. You know, this is not actually the way the world works, and these are not real people. And there is, I think, a consciousness of that which comes out of a certain kind of theatrical tradition, you know, in which it's quite Shakespearean, right? When you think of something like Kabuki, the style of performance is outsized. Again, it's larger. It's marked by conventions, by certain kind of poses and certain sorts of noises, and certain, which is not the way that ordinary people actually behave. But there's no paradox there because the art form does not assume that it's being realist, right? That's a 20th century invention and and in many ways a Western invention, that we tend to think that we all know what good acting is, but we don't. We assume that good acting means hyper-realist, naturalist acting, though our sense of what that is constantly changing. You know, and if you go back and look at movies from 50 years ago, and you're like, it doesn't look real, right? It's not, well, because the conventions of the day change. And I think sometimes with Japanese film and TV, that there is a slightly different notion of acting, which is a little bit more presentational than it is strictly representational, right? There's a conveyance of story and character rather than an entire inhabiting of that character and delivering it as if it's absolutely realist. And that's not a failure to be realistic. That's a different aesthetic choice, right? You know, Shakespeare's written mostly in iambic pentameter. Nobody ever spoke iambic pentameter. That's not how people used to speak. You go into the theatre in that period, and what you're hearing is bigger than life, and it's structured, and it's given an aesthetic feel because these are big stories. And that was the rule of the day, you know? It's not just that this is somehow that we've evolved away from there. We found other ways to find our sense of scale. Anyway, so yeah, so you know, some people are like, oh, I don't think the acting's that great. Well, you know, you're wrong. You're applying the wrong set of standards, whether they're cultural or aesthetic. There's nothing wrong with the acting. Sorry, that's how I feel. So the spoiler thing that I was sort of avoiding is that this show aired in 2018. And 2020, the lead actress, Takeuchi Yuko, died. Apparently by her own hand. Though it's not entirely clear, there was no suicide note, and a lot of the family at the time contradicted the sense that she was clearly depressed or struggling with anything in particular. And as is common in Japan, though there was a sort of flurry of media attention, it then seems to have mostly gone away, or at least gone away in forms that I can find. And, you know, some of this, I suspect, is there's a certain closed-mouthed approach to issues of depression. She had recently had a child, so it could be that postpartum was a factor, though again, family suggest otherwise. And you know, when the news came out, there was a certain amount of backlash, which is extraordinary to me. People attacking her online for killing herself because she had a child and a family, and how can you leave the child? It's like, people who kill themselves are not in that mindset of, oh, well, I'm now going to do something selfish. Come on. And keep that stuff off this video, please, as well. Keep that out of the comments. I will not be sympathetic to that. Watching the show, knowing that she's dead, is particularly heartbreaking, I think, because the work is so good. You know, her work, she was obviously a very serious actor. I read stuff about how hard she worked with the cello stuff to make it look like she was going to be able, that she could play convincingly on camera. She seems to have been a very positive person on set in terms of dealing with the other people. So it's mysterious and tragic, you know? And I think that when you watch the show knowing that she's dead, it does color the way you see the character. And there are, as I said, these moments where you suddenly glimpse something underneath the superficial, which feels heartfelt, feels as much like it's about the actor playing the part as it does the actor. And I was talking about Jeremy Brett before, and Brett was a depressive. And it was something that he understood about Sherlock Holmes, and I think you see it in his performance. That those black moods that Arthur Conan Doyle talks about are absolutely real. It's not just boredom. It's not just irritation, as it is sometimes, I think, in the BBC version. But there's something more profound about the brand of melancholy that we get both from Jeremy Brett and from Miss Sherlock. Which is sad. It absolutely breaks my heart that we won't see a second season. And the way that season 1 ends is particularly painful when you know that there isn't a second season, you know? Or that we won't see her in anything else because she was obviously a remarkable talent. As far as the suicide thing is concerned, you know, I've seen discussions about Japan's unwillingness to talk about these things. And so, you know, the one thing that I would add is that wherever you are, if you find yourself in that mindset where suicide starts to look like something that you're actually seriously considering, please talk to somebody. I don't think people realize how much they are valued by others, how much richness there can still be in life, even when it seems bleak. That's all. Treat yourself to this show. It's really good. I strongly recommend it.